Hotel connections, the weight of the brass key, the limestone facade of the Grand Meridian stood like a fortress of Gilded Age ambition in the heart of the city's historic district. It was a monument to the legacy of Arthur Lewis, a man who had started his career with a single grease-stained polishing rag in a windowless boiler room and ended it with a global portfolio of five-star luxury properties. To the outside world, the hotel was a symphony of seamlessly orchestrated prestige. Turkish marble floors buffed to a liquid mirror finish, massive crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, champagne-colored glow over visiting diplomats, and the faint, expensive scent of amber and cedarwood piped through the brass ventilation grates. To Kurt Lewis, however, the hotel was a gilded cage designed to test the limits of his inheritance. At 24, Kurt possessed the quiet, effortless confidence that only a top-tier Swiss hospitality education and an elite international upbringing could buy. He had spent the last 4 years in Lausanne, mastering the complex geometry of yield management, global asset valuation, and the subtle, high-stakes psychology of luxury consumer behavior. He was a Lewis, tall, sharp-jawed, with his father's piercing grey eyes and an analytical mind that categorized human interactions into efficiency metrics and service standards. He was prepared to walk into the boardroom. He was prepared to sit at his father's right hand, wielding a gold-plated Montblanc pen to sign off on multi-million-dollar acquisitions. But Arthur Lewis had not built a multi-billion-dollar empire by allowing his only son to inherit an empire he had never swept. The transition from the pristine mountain air of Lausanne to the humid, subterranean depths of the Meridian's basement locker room had occurred in a single, unyielding afternoon. Kurt remembered the scent of his father's study, the rich, dark mahogany, the heavy leather chairs, and the smoke from a single, expensive Cuban cigar curling toward the ceiling. Arthur had looked at his son not with the eyes of a doting parent, but with the fierce, calculating gaze of a self-made titan. "You have the credentials, Kurt," Arthur had said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying the weight of half a century of struggle. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and weathered, carrying the scars of his early labor like medals of honor. "You know how to read a balance sheet, and you know how to calculate Rev PAR in your sleep. But you don't know the hotel. You don't know the people who scrub the tiles, the people who carry the heavy leather suitcases up 30 flights of stairs when the service elevator breaks, or the guests who treat my staff like invisible scenery." Arthur had leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the desk. "A hotel is not an asset class, son. It is a living, breathing ecosystem of human connections. And the most dangerous place for a future leader to stand is at the top of a mountain he has never climbed. You will enter the management pipeline, yes, but not as a vice president. You will start tomorrow morning at 5:00 a.m. You will wear the brass-buttoned wool of a Bellman at the Grand Meridian. For 6 months, your name is Kurt Vance. No one in that building, not the general manager, not the department heads, and certainly not the staff, will know who your father is. You will watch, you will listen, and you will learn the character of the people who represent our name." "And if I refuse?" Kurt had asked, his pride stinging under the weight of the mandate. Arthur had smiled, a slow, loyal, but fiercely uncompromising expression. "Then you are welcome to find employment at a competitor's establishment, but you will do so without a single cent of my capital and without the Lewis name on your resume. The choice is yours." The choice, of course, had been no choice at all. Now, 4 weeks into his disguise, Kurt stood beneath the towering bronze awning of the main entrance, his shoulders aching beneath the heavy, double-breasted maroon wool coat of a Meridian Bellman. The fabric was stiff, smelling faintly of industrial dry cleaning and the sweat of the 3 men who had worn it before him. A cold, biting autumn wind swept off the avenue, carrying a fine spray of rain that stung his cheeks as he waited for the next Blacktown car to pull up to the curb. His world had shrunk to a series of physical trials. He carried heavy, overpacked designer luggage that strained his lower back. He stood for 8 hours on a marble floor that turned his feet into blocks of dull, throbbing pain, and he smiled, constantly, unblinkingly, while wealthy patrons barked orders at him without making eye contact. But the physical toll was nothing compared to the psychological shift. In Lausanne, Kurt had been a figure of consequence, a young man of pedigree whose opinions were sought after in seminar rooms. Here, wearing the brass buttons and the pillbox cap, He had become entirely invisible. To the high-ranking executive staff who entered through the grand rotating doors, Kurt was less than a human being. He was a piece of the lobby furniture, a utility designed to move bags from point A to point B. He watched the director of rooms, a fastidious man named Sterling, stride past the bell stand every morning. Sterling wore bespoke Italian suits and carried himself with the manicured arrogance of a minor royal. Not once in 4 weeks had Sterling offered a nod of acknowledgement, let alone a greeting. Once, when Kurt had moved slightly too slowly to open the door for him while balanced under 4 heavy leather duffels, Sterling had let out a sharp, disgusted clicking sound with his tongue. "Keep the lane clear, boy," Sterling had muttered, not even glancing at Kurt's face. The guests shouldn't have to navigate around the labor. The word had burned in Kurt's throat like acid. He had to clench his fist inside his white cotton glove to keep from pointing out that the labor had a degree from a university Sterling could never afford to send his own children to. But he had held his tongue, remembering his father's words. "You are here to learn their character," but the lobby was only half of his education. Part of his rotation required him to spend several hours a week stationed at the employee entrance, a sterile, drafty concrete security post located in the subterranean bowels of the building, where the staff entered and exited. Here, Kurt acted as an auxiliary security guard, logging the arrival times of the housekeeping staff, checking the bags of the kitchen crew for pilfered silver, and monitoring the metal detector. It was a bleak, windowless place that smelled of damp concrete and commercial laundry detergent. The employees who descended into this basement were tired, their faces lined with the gray fatigue of early morning commutes and late-night shifts. Most of them passed through the security checkpoint in absolute silence, their heads down, their eyes fixed on the linoleum floor, as if trying to preserve the last scraps of their energy before the hotel consumed them for the day. But there was one exception. At exactly 6:45 a.m. every morning, the heavy steel fire door at the end of the concrete corridor would swing open, and Kate would walk in. Kate was an assistant manager in the events and catering department, a mid-level operational role that carried twice the workload of the senior directors with none of the prestige. She was 25, with bright, expressive hazel eyes that seemed entirely untouched by the cynical gray weight of the hospitality industry. Her dark hair was always pulled back into a neat, professional chignon, and her tailored navy blue suits, though clearly purchased from a mid-range department store, were always perfectly pressed, her silver name tag polished to a shine. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Kurt's attention, it was her spirit. No matter how brutal the autumn weather was, no matter how early the shift, or how exhausting the previous night's gala had been, Kate entered the basement corridor like a burst of warm sunlight breaking through a concrete cloud. "Good morning, Kurt," she would say, her voice carrying a genuine melodic warmth as she stepped up to the security desk. She didn't just flash her ID card. She looked him directly in the eyes, her smile bright and completely devoid of the artificial, transactional politeness that characterized the lobby upstairs. "Brutal wind out there today, isn't it? Make sure you get a hot cup of tea from the canteen during your break. You look like you're freezing." Kurt felt his breath catch in his throat every time she spoke his name. To the rest of the hotel, he was Vance or the boy on the stand. To her, he was Kurt, a person, an equal. "I'm holding up, Kate," he stammered on a Tuesday morning, his fingers clumsily logging her entry time into the ledger. "The wool coat helps, a bit." She let out a soft, musical laugh that echoed beautifully against the sterile concrete walls of the checkpoint. "Don't let the front office director catch you complaining about the uniform. He thinks those brass buttons are a cure for hypothermia. Have a wonderful shift, Kurt." She offered a quick, encouraging nod before walking toward the service elevator, her heels clicking a lively, purposeful rhythm against the floorboards. Kurt watched her go, a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in his chest. In the elite social circles of Lausanne and London, he had been surrounded by women of immense wealth and engineered beauty, women who calculated their interactions based on social capital and familial lineage. But none of them possessed a fraction of the genuine grace that Kate carried in her worn leather flats. She treated the laundry maids with the same profound, unshakable respect she offered to the high-paying convention organizers. She knew the names of the night shift dishwashers. She asked about the security guards' families, and she never passed his desk without offering a moment of real human connection. To Kurt, she was the epitome of what a true hotelier should be, a master of the invisible, sacred threads that bound people together under a single roof. But he was a bellman, a ghost in a maroon uniform, and she was a rising star in management. He knew the rules of the disguise. He had to keep his distance, to remain an observer in his father's grand experiment. He could not offer her his real name, his real status, or the feelings that were beginning to take root in his heart. He had to remain a part of the architecture, watching from the shadows of the grand entrance while she illuminated the halls above. He had no idea that the silent, observation-based sanctuary he had built for himself was about to be shattered, or that the true test of his character and the future of the Grand Meridian would begin not in the boardroom, but in the dark corners of the executive offices. The view from the bottom, the morning rush at the Grand Meridian, was an unforgiving machine. By 7:30 a.m., the quiet elegance of the lobby was swallowed by a tidal wave of arrivals and departures. Sleek black sedans and luxury SUVs lined the curb three-deep under the bronze awning, their exhaust plumes curling like smoke in the crisp autumn air. Doors slammed, cell phones buzzed with international ringtones, and the high-pitched chatter of wealthy travelers filled the vaulted space. Kurt stood at the center of the storm, his maroon wool uniform feeling heavier by the hour. His hands, encased in white cotton gloves, were already stained with the dark grease of luggage wheel axles and the gritty residue of road grime. He moved on pure instinct now: lift, load, smile. Repeat, Bellman, take these to the penthouse. A voice barked from behind him. Kurt turned to find a senior investment banker in a pinstriped suit, tossing a set of heavy Tumi garment bags onto the brass cart without looking up from his tablet. The man didn't wait for an acknowledgement. He simply strode toward the reception desk, leaving Kurt to manage the unbalanced weight of the luggage before it tipped over onto the marble floor. Kurt caught the cart just in time, his muscles straining beneath the stiff wool. For a split second, the elite university graduate inside him wanted to leave the bags on the floor, step out of the uniform, and call his father's private line. He wanted to tell Arthur Lewis that the experiment had proven its point, that the wealthy could be insufferable, and that the front-of-house operations were physically exhausting. But as he adjusted the leather straps, he caught sight of his reflection in the polished brass sphere of the luggage cart. He didn't see Kurt Lewis, the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. He saw Kurt Vance, a 24-year-old employee whose survival depended on a $600 weekly stipend. He swallowed his pride, gripped the rubber handle of the cart, and pushed it toward the service elevators. The service elevator was the true artery of the hotel, a windowless, stainless steel box scratched by years of utility carts and room service trays. It smelled permanently of burnt coffee, industrial disinfectant, and the heavy, collective fatigue of the staff. It was here, away from the manicured gazes of the guests, that the masks of the hospitality industry truly slipped. The elevator jarred to a halt on the fourth floor, the heavy doors sliding open to reveal Sterling, the director of rooms, standing alongside the hotel's chief legal counsel and head of human resources, Julian Thorne. Thorne was a man who exuded an unsettling, oily kind of power. He was an attorney by trade, a sharp-featured man in his late 40s with slicked-back silver hair and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the legal liability of a room before he entered it. Within the corporate structure of the Lewis Hotel Group, Thorne was considered an indispensable fixture. He had protected the Meridian from high-profile union disputes, quietly settled employee grievances out of court, and kept the operational ledger pristine. But throughout the subterranean break rooms and locker quarters, his name was spoken only in hushed, guarded whispers. Kurt stepped back, pulling his cart into the corner of the elevator to afford the executive's maximum space. He lowered his head, adopting the invisible posture required of his station. "I don't care about the housekeeping staff's complaints regarding the new shift rotations," Julian, Sterling was saying, his voice laced with casual irritation as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. "The convention is next week. We need maximum coverage on the floors. If they don't like the hours, they can find another establishment to sweep." Thorne offered a thin, razor-sharp smile, his fingers tapping lazily against his leather briefcase. Legally, we are within our rights to alter the scheduling parameters under the current employment addendum. Let them complain. If any of them try to take it to the board, I'll handle it. They don't have the resources to fight an arbitration clause. Exactly why we pay you the big bucks, Thorne, Sterling chuckled, stepping out as the elevator reached the executive level. Thorne didn't follow him immediately. He lingered in the doorway, his eyes sweeping across the interior of the elevator before landing on Kurt. For a tense second, Kurt wondered if the brilliant corporate attorney had somehow seen through the cheap uniform and the false name on his brass badge. But the look in Thorne's eyes wasn't one of recognition. It was one of supreme, untouchable dismissal. Make sure those bags are in the penthouse before the guest arrives, boy, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a smooth, condescending drawl. The Meridian doesn't tolerate tardiness from the basement staff. Right away, sir, Kurt replied, keeping his tone perfectly flat, his eyes fixed on the elevator floor until the doors slid shut. The interaction left a bitter taste in his mouth. In his university courses, management had been defined as the art of maximizing human capital through leadership and empathy. But here, in the actual trenches of his father's flagship property, the high-ranking directors viewed the employees as mere operating expenses, cogs to be ground down and replaced whenever the machinery groaned. When his shift on the Bell stand finally concluded at noon, Kurt retreated to the basement security checkpoint for his auxiliary rotation. The transition from the warm, opulent luxury of the lobby to the drafty concrete corridors of the lower levels was always a jolt to the system. He took his seat behind the gray laminate desk, opening the heavy ledger to log the shift changes. The atmosphere in the basement was decidedly different from the executive floors. Here, the connections were real, forged in the shared hardship of the labor. The kitchen staff shared leftover pastries from the morning buffet, and the laundry workers swapped stories about their children over styrofoam cups of lukewarm chicory coffee. At exactly 12:45 p.m., the fire door clicked open. Kurt's posture straightened automatically, sudden electric warmth cutting through the chill of the concrete room. Kate walked into the corridor, carrying a stack of oversized laminated banquet blueprints under her arm. Her navy suit jacket was unbuttoned, and a stray wisp of dark hair had escaped her neat chignon, framing her face in a way that made her look remarkably young and human. Despite the visible exhaustion in the lines of her shoulders, her hazel eyes lit up the moment she saw him sitting behind the desk. "Afternoon, Kurt," she said, stepping up to the counter and setting the heavy blueprints down with a soft thud. She took a deep breath, blowing a puff of air upward to clear the loose strand of hair from her eyes. "Please tell me you have good news from the outside world. Is the sun still out there somewhere?" "It is," Kurt smiled, his hand steadying as he turned the ledger toward her. "Though I think it's hidden behind a few layers of autumn fog." "How is the planning for the Medical Association gala going?" Kate groaned playfully, leaning her elbows against the laminate counter. "Don't ask. The committee changed the seating arrangements for the third time this morning, and the banquet captain just told me 2 of our main ovens in the pastry kitchen are down. I've been running between the culinary office and the floor director for 3 hours." "That sounds like a logistical nightmare," Kurt observed, his hospitality training slipping through his words. "Have they considered outsourcing the dessert course to a local patisserie to alleviate the kitchen bottleneck?" Kate blinked, her hazel eyes widening slightly as she looked at him. For a brief, terrifying moment, Kurt realized he had spoken like a management consultant, not a bellman working a security gate. A soft, intrigued smile touched Kate's lips. "That's actually an incredibly smart solution, Kurt. I didn't think a bellman would have an eye for kitchen logistics." Kurt cleared his throat quickly, shifting his eyes down to the ledger. "Oh, you hear things standing around the lobby. The drivers talk. The kitchen staff complains in the elevators. You pick up a few things here and there." "Well, you picked up the right things," she said gently, her tone dropping into that warm, sincere register that always managed to dismantle his defenses. She reached into her pocket and placed a small, foil-wrapped chocolate square on the ledger. "A little operational hazard pay for the best security guard on the property." Kurt looked at the chocolate, then up at her face. The simplicity of the gesture touched him more deeply than any corporate bonus or academic accolade ever had. "Thank you, Kate. You really don't have to do that." Everyone deserves to be recognized, Kurt, she said softly, her eyes holding his with an earnest intensity. Especially the people who keep this place running while the front office takes all the credit. I'll see you tomorrow morning. She gathered her blueprints, offered a warm nod, and headed toward the service elevator. Kurt picked up the small chocolate square, the foil catching the harsh fluorescent light of the basement. He didn't eat it. Instead, he carefully placed it into the breast pocket of his uniform, right behind his brass name badge. As the weeks wore on, Kurt found himself living a double life that extended far beyond his physical presence in the hotel. In the evenings, he returned to a modest, one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood, an apartment his father had rented for him under the Vance pseudonym, stripped of the luxury linens and high-speed amenities he had grown up with. He cooked his own meals, washed his own uniforms in a communal laundry room, and spent his nights reviewing the hotel's public financial statements, mapping the discrepancies between the sparkling revenue reports and the human cost he witnessed daily in the basement. He was learning the true definition of a hotel connection. It wasn't the contract signed between a corporate entity and a luxury travel agency. It was the invisible web of respect, dignity, and shared labor that kept the walls from collapsing under the weight of the guests' expectations. He saw how the dishwashers worked through minor burns without complaining because they knew the line cooks depended on clean pans. He saw how the housekeeping maids covered sections for one another when a child was sick, shielding each other from Sterling's strict absenteeism policies. And at the center of it all, he saw Kate, a tireless, dedicated manager who acted as a buffer between the cold corporate machinery above and the vulnerable human beings below. He had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with her, but it was a love defined by distance and discipline. He knew that the moment he revealed his true identity, the fragile, beautiful equality of their interactions would shatter. She would no longer see the quiet, observant young man who shared her early morning complaints. She would see the billionaire heir, the son of the owner, a figure of corporate authority to be feared or handled with professional caution. So, he kept his secret hidden beneath the brass buttons of his maroon coat. He guarded her arrival every morning, counted the days left in his 6-month sentence, and prayed that when the truth finally came to light, the connection they had built in the shadow of the Grand Hotel would be strong enough to survive the weight of his real name. He had no inkling that the survival of that connection would soon depend on a battle far more dangerous than simple corporate politics. The fractured key, the atmospheric shift from November to December, was palpable within the grand limestone walls of the hotel. Holiday wreaths woven with expensive pine and velvet ribbons were hung by the engineering crew, and a towering 30-foot Christmas tree was erected in the center of the lobby, its thousands of white fairy lights reflecting off the Turkish marble. To the guests, it was a winter wonderland of unparalleled luxury. To the staff, it was the beginning of the grueling, high-volume holiday event season. Kurt's routine had hardened into a rigorous mechanical cycle. He had entered his 4th month as Kurt Vance, and the initial physical shock of the labor had morphed into lean, resilient endurance. His hands were calloused beneath his white cotton gloves, his back had adapted to the weight of overpacked luxury trunks, and his gray eyes had grown increasingly sharp, cataloging every detail of the building's operational culture. He had learned to read the underlying current of the Grand Meridian with the precision of a seasoned investigator. But the more he observed, the more he realized that the hotel's corporate facade was built over a deeply fractured foundation. The primary fault line in that foundation lay within the executive wing on the 3rd floor, specifically behind the double oak doors of the Human Resources Suite. Julian Thorne's influence had grown increasingly pervasive as the holiday season peaked. As the chief legal counsel and head of HR, Thorne operated with the absolute immunity of a man who knew where every metaphorical body was buried in the Lewis Hotel Group. While Arthur Lewis remained at the corporate headquarters overseas or in private boardrooms, Thorne ran the flagship property like his own personal fiefdom. Kurt began to notice the subtle, insidious patterns of Thorne's behavior during his afternoon rotations at the basement security checkpoint. It started with the younger female employees from the food and beverage departments. Kurt would watch them descend the concrete stairs after a meeting in Thorne's office, their faces pale, their eyes fixed forward with a rigid, defensive blankness that he had learned to recognize as fear. He heard the hushed, fragmented conversations in the staff elevators, whispered warnings passed between the banquet servers and the front desk agents. Don't go into his office alone after 5. They would say when they thought the bellman wasn't listening. If he offers to review your promotion file over a drink, find an excuse. The firm always takes his side. The knowledge burned in Kurt's chest like a slow-burning fire. He wanted to document it, to compile a formal brief, and send it directly to his father's private encryption line. But he knew the strict rules of the mandate. He had no concrete evidence, no formal complaints. And if he acted prematurely as Kurt Lewis, Thorne's legal brilliance would allow him to scrub the record, destroy the victims' careers, and walk away untouched. Kurt had to wait, to watch, and to let the character of the hotel reveal itself fully. But the detached calculation of his observation vanished entirely on a freezing Thursday afternoon. Kurt was stationed at the main lobby entrance, helping an elderly couple load their luggage into a waiting town car. When the heavy glass rotating doors burst open from the inside, it was Kate. She didn't have her usual stack of banquet blueprints, and her navy blue blazer was clutched tightly across her chest as if she were trying to hold herself together against a sudden physical blow. Her dark hair was slightly disheveled, a few strands escaping her chignon, but it was her face that made Kurt freeze entirely. Her skin was a stark, bloodless white, and tears were streaming openly down her cheeks, glittering under the bright holiday chandeliers of the lobby. She didn't look at the reception desk, she didn't look at the guests, and she didn't look at him. She sprinted past the bell stand, her heels clicking violently against the marble floor as she headed straight for the employee exit doors that led out into the freezing side alley. Kurt didn't hesitate. The uniform, the disguise, the 6-month mandate, everything dissolved in a single, roaring spike of protective adrenaline. "Vance, where are you going? We have an arrival on the curb," the assistant front office manager shouted from behind the desk. Kurt ignored him completely. He tore off his white cotton gloves, shoved them into his pocket, and pushed through the heavy service door, stepping out into the biting winter air of the alleyway. The cold hit him instantly, but he barely felt it. He scanned the narrow, concrete passage between the hotel and the adjacent office tower. A few yards away, huddled against the corrugated steel of the commercial laundry intake bay, Kate was on her knees, her hands covering her face as her entire body shook with violent, suffocating sobs. Kurt approached her slowly, his boots crunching against the light dusting of frost on the pavement. He knelt down beside her on the cold concrete, his broad frame blocking the biting wind from the avenue. "Kate," he said, his voice dropping its formal employee register, turning into something deep, raw, and completely filled with an agonizing gentleness. "Kate, look at me, it's Kurt, what happened?" Kate flinched at the sound of his voice, her shoulders tensing before she slowly lifted her head. Her hazel eyes were bloodshot, wide with a mixture of terror, humiliation, and a profound, heartbreaking shock. When she recognized his face, the quiet, protective Bellman, who had become her single point of warmth in the building, the rigid armor of her professional persona fractured completely. She reached out, her fingers locking onto the thick maroon wool of his lapels with a desperation that strained her knuckles. He locked the door, Kurt," she choked out, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of tears spilled over her lashes. "I went up to deliver the final catering payroll authorizations for the holiday galas. Secretary had already gone home. Julian, Thorne, he locked the office door behind me." Kurt felt his entire body go perfectly still, his muscles locking into iron. The gray of his eyes turned to a cold, lethal flint. "What did he do, Kate?" "He told me that my promotion to director of events was sitting on his desk," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently her teeth clicked together. He said the corporate office didn't care about my tenure, that they only cared about his recommendation." Then he moved close to me. He trapped me against the filing cabinet. He forced himself on me, Kurt. He kissed my neck, and when I tried to push him away, he told me that if I made a sound, he would file a counter-complaint for professional misconduct and ensure I never worked in hospitality again. He said he was an attorney, that he owned the HR department, and that no one would ever believe a mid-level manager over him. She buried her face into Kurt's chest, her small frame convulsing as she wept against his uniform. Kurt wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly into his space, his chin resting against the top of her head. He could feel the rapid, terrified rhythm of her heartbeat against his ribs. The fury that rolled through his veins was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a primitive, blinding rage that made him want to walk up to the third floor and tear Thorne apart with his bare hands. But as he held her in the freezing alleyway, the elite education and the unyielding discipline of his father's training asserted itself through the anger. A physical confrontation would play right into Thorne's hands. It would be viewed as a rogue Bellman assaulting an executive, resulting in terminations, police interventions, and a massive corporate cover-up that would leave Kate broken and Thorne protected by his legal fortress. If they were going to bring a billionaire's indispensable attorney down, they had to do it with the absolute, systematic precision of an execution. "Kate, listen to me," Kurt said, his voice dropping into a low, completely unshakable baritone as he gently pulled her back so she could see his face. He reached up, his thumb tenderly wiping a frozen tear from her cheek. "Look at me, he is wrong. He doesn't own this hotel, and he doesn't own your future. I am not going to let him touch you again, and I am not going to let him destroy what you've built. Do you trust me?" Kate looked into his grey eyes, seeing a strange, commanding power there that didn't belong to a 24-year-old Bellman, an authority that felt as solid and immutable as the limestone walls of the hotel itself. She swallowed hard, her chest heaving as she gave a single, resolute nod. "I trust you, Kurt." "Good," he said, helping her stand up, his hands steadying her balance on the icy ground. "We aren't going to the internal HR desk. That's his territory. We are going to do this scientifically. Did he touch your blazer, your collar?" She nodded, her fingers hovering near the silk lapel of her navy jacket. "Yes, he grabbed my shoulders when he pinned me against the cabinet." "Don't touch the fabric," Kurt commanded gently. "We are going to preserve the physical evidence. I'm going to walk you to your car, and you are going to go straight to a private clinic outside the district to document the physical distress. But before we do that, we need to gather the data. Thorne is arrogant, but he is a lawyer. He leaves a paper trail, even if he thinks he deletes it. We need the access logs for the third-floor executive corridor, and we need the testimonies of the other women he has targeted." Kate wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a spark of her innate managerial resilience beginning to clear the terror from her gaze. "The evening shift log security files. I have administrative access to the operational backup servers because of my event coordination clearances. I can pull the electronic keycard access data for his office suite for the last 3 months. I know which female staff members were called up there after hours." "Pull it," Kurt said, his grip on her hand tightening with a quiet, fierce solidarity. "Compile every timestamp, every late-night key swipe, and every deleted scheduling email you can find. I will handle the rest." "But Kurt," Kate whispered, her hazel eyes filling with a sudden, fresh wave of anxiety as she looked at his maroon uniform. "He's the head of legal. He's irreplaceable to the Lewis Group. Even if we have the data, who is going to force the general manager to look at it? Who is going to stop him from burying us?" Kurt looked up at the towering, pristine facade of the Grand Meridian, his grey eyes reflecting the cold brilliance of the holiday lights. The disguise felt lighter now, no longer a burden of humility, but a weapon of absolute tactical advantage. His father wanted him to know the character of the people who wore the Lewis name. Well, he had learned it. He had seen the absolute purity of the staff at the bottom, and he had witnessed the predatory rot at the high-ranking top. He looked back down at Kate, his features softening into that slow, reassuring smile that carried the entire, unexpressed weight of his love for her. "Let him think he's indispensable, Kate," Kurt said softly, his voice carrying the silent, echoing thunder of the family name he had spent 4 months concealing. "The higher the tower is, the harder it crashes when you remove the foundation. Get the data. I promise you, by the time this week ends, Julian Thorne will realize that there are some connections in this hotel that no amount of corporate capital can save." The archive of whispers, to dismantle a legal fortress, one does not hammer against the front gates, one maps the hidden structural flaws until the entire edifice is ready to buckle under its own weight. The next 10 days, the Grand Meridian operated under a tense, artificial equilibrium. To the high-paying holiday guests, the hotel remained a seamless theater of festive luxury. Carolers in Victorian garb sang beneath the towering lobby pine, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from the culinary stations, and the brass luggage carts glided silently across the polished marble. But in the drafty concrete corridors of the basement, the atmosphere had grown thin, cold, and electric. Kurt lived in a state of hypervigilance. He performed his duties on the bell stand with a mechanical perfection that left the front office directors with no cause for complaint. But his mind was entirely occupied by the silent war occurring behind the scenes. Every evening, after his shift concluded at the security desk, he met Kate in the quiet, dusty archives of the catering and events storage department, a windowless room on the sublevel 2 floor, packed with decommissioned silver platters, stacks of velvet chair covers, and old banquet registries. It was the only place in the building where the surveillance cameras did not reach, a small, cluttered sanctuary lit by a single hanging bulb. There, under the pretense of auditing the holiday inventory, they built their case. Kate was remarkable. The initial, paralyzing terror of her encounter with Thorne had crystallized into a cold, methodical determination. She sat on an upturned wooden crate, her laptop open on her knees, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a rapid, rhythmic cadence. "I've pulled the primary access logs from the third-floor executive wing for the last 4 months," she whispered, her voice low but carrying a sharp, resilient edge. She turned the screen toward Kurt, who was leaning against a stack of vintage gold plate chargers. Because the Human Resources Suite handles sensitive employee files, every entry and exit requires a physical keycard swipe. The system automatically backroutes the data to the central server in the catering division for billing allocation. They never thought to scrub the secondary servers. Kurt leaned in, his gray eyes narrowing as he scanned the lines of digital timestamps. "Look at the pattern," he murmured, his analytical hospitality training automatically identifying the anomalies. Thorne's private office card was swiped after 6:00 p.m. on 28 separate occasions over the last 90 days. And in 22 of those instances, a female employee from the junior operations or food and beverage departments swiped her card into the same suite within 5 minutes of his arrival. "It's a pattern of systemic isolation," Kate said, her hazel eyes darkening with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "And look at this. Within 48 hours of those specific timestamps, 3 of those employees resigned. The HR exit interview files, which I managed to access through the shared departmental portal, all list personal reasons or voluntary career transitions. But I know these girls, Kurt. Mia from the pastry kitchen didn't just decide to leave her career to move back to the countryside. She was terrified. She wouldn't even look me in the eye when she cleared out her locker." Kurt reached out, his hand resting gently over hers, stopping her fingers from their frantic typing. The warmth of his touch instantly cut through the damp chill of the storage room, and he felt a subtle tremor run through her fingers before her hand relaxed under his grip. "Did you contact them?" Kurt asked softly. "I did," Kate nodded, looking up at him, her face illuminated by the stark light of the single bulb. "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. They were so scared, Kurt. They thought Julian would find out, that he would use his legal contacts to blacklist them from any hotel group in the country. But when I told them they weren't alone, and that we were building a file that would go straight to the ownership level, they started to talk. I have signed, written statements from Mia and 2 other girls. They described the exact same methodology Thorne used on me. The locked office door, the promise of promotion, the immediate threats of professional ruin if they resisted." She closed her laptop with a soft, definitive click, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "We have the physical evidence from my blazer. The clinic documented the bruising on my shoulders and preserved the touch DNA from the lapels. We have the electronic timestamps. We have the witness testimonies. It's an open and shut case, Kurt. Any court in the state would convict him." "But this isn't just about a court," Kurt said, his voice dropping into a low, grave baritone. "Thorne is a master of corporate delay. If we file this through standard legal channels, his lawyers will tie the case up in preliminary motions for months. He will use his position as chief legal counsel to access the hotel's defensive funds, and he will bury the hotel group in a public relations nightmare before he ever steps foot in a courtroom. We have to bypass the system entirely. We have to strike at the only authority he cannot litigate against." Kate looked at him, her brow furrowing with a sudden sharp curiosity. "You keep talking like you know exactly how the ownership structure operates, Kurt. You're a Bellman. How do you expect to get a file like this past Sterling, past the general manager, and straight to Arthur Lewis's desk? The billionaire mogul doesn't take meetings with the basement staff. Kurt felt a sudden, familiar tightness in his throat. He looked at her beautiful, earnest face, seeing the absolute trust in her hazel eyes, and he felt the immense weight of the secret he had been carrying for 4 months. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to tell her that the man she had been sharing her morning coffee complaints with was the very heir she believed was unreachable. But he knew that to do so now, in the middle of the battle, would introduce an element of uncertainty that could compromise her focus. He had to remain Kurt Vance for just a little longer. He had to let the trap snap shut before he revealed the identity of the hunter. Because Arthur Lewis isn't the cold, unreachable corporate entity the front office thinks he is, Kurt said softly, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. My father used to tell me stories about him. He's a self-made man, Kate. He started at the bottom. He built this empire on the idea that every employee is a vital connection. If we present him with undeniable proof that his name is being used to shield a predator who abuses his people, he won't call his lawyers. He will handle it himself. Kate studied his face, her eyes searching the contours of his features, sensing a deep, unshakable truth behind his words that she couldn't quite put her finger on. You're a very unusual Bellman. Kurt Vance, she whispered, a small, tender smile breaking through the gravity of her expression. I've had a very unusual education, he replied, his smile matching hers as he reached down to help her gather her things. But right now, we need to focus on the delivery. Thorne knows we are quiet, but he's starting to get suspicious. He noticed you haven't submitted the catering payroll files for his signature yet. I've been delaying, she admitted, her shoulders tensing slightly as they walked toward the heavy metal door. He's called my office twice today. His secretary said he wants me to come up to his suite tomorrow afternoon to finalize the holiday budget allocation. Alone. Kurt's grip on the door handle tightened until his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. The lethal flint returned to his gray eyes, his entire posture radiating a cold, commanding authority that belonged to a prince preparing for war. Let him schedule the meeting, Kurt said, his voice dropping into a register that was as hard and absolute as the limestone walls above them. Accept the appointment for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. But you aren't going to be alone, Kate, and Julian Thorne is about to find out that the basement staff of the Grand Meridian has a very long, very unyielding memory. The alignment of the spoke, the morning of the confrontation, arrived with a cold, pale sunlight that bled through the leaded glass windows of the executive wing, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet corridors. On the 3rd floor, the atmosphere was thick with corporate insulation. Here, the hum of the basement laundry chute and the frantic clack of the lobby bell stand were entirely muffled by thick, plush navy carpets and double-insulated oak doors. It was a space designed to project absolute, unshakable control. Kurt spent the early hours of his shift performing a very different kind of logistical preparation. He had adjusted his rotation at the bell stand, swapping hours with a junior colleague to ensure he was assigned to the internal elevator bank that serviced the executive suites between 1 and 3 o'clock. His uniform was immaculate, every brass button polished to a high sheen, his maroon trousers pressed to a razor edge, his white cotton gloves spotless. But beneath the pristine attire, his body was coiled like a steel spring. The electronic data, the signed statements from the former employees, and the medical documentation from Kate's clinic visit had all been compiled into a single, encrypted digital folder. At precisely 1:30 p.m., Kurt took his position near the service entrance of the 3rd floor, blending into the background of the wood-paneled hallway like a piece of high-end utility hardware. At 1:45 p.m., the heavy security door at the end of the hall clicked open, and Julian Thorne walked out of the executive boardroom, accompanied by Sterling. Thorne looked completely unbothered, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his laughter smooth and resonant as he gestured with a gold fountain pen toward a set of quarterly reports. We'll finalize the room allocations for the investment group by Monday, Sterling, Thorne was saying, his voice carrying the effortless arrogance of a man who believed the walls of the Meridian were built solely to protect his interests. Legally, we've insulated the property from any occupancy disputes. You have nothing to worry about. Excellent work, Julian. Sterling smiled, offering a brief, dismissive nod to Kurt as he passed him, completely ignoring the bellman's presence as he headed toward the main elevators. Thorne turned on his heel and walked toward his private suite at the end of the corridor. As he reached the double oak doors, his eyes flicked over to Kurt, who stood perfectly still against the mahogany wall, his head slightly bowed. "You," Thorne barked, pointing the gold pen at Kurt's chest. "Bellman, what's your name?" "Vance, sir," Kurt replied, keeping his voice flat, completely devoid of any inflection that might betray the calculated fury burning beneath his uniform. "Right, Vance," Thorne said, keys jingling in his hand as he unlocked his private office door. "The catering manager is coming up at 2 to deliver the holiday budget files. I don't want to be interrupted by the front desk crew with minor guest complaints. Stand by the elevator bank. If anyone tries to come down this wing before 3, tell them the legal department is in a closed session." "Understood. Perfectly, Mr. Thorne," Kurt said, his gray eyes lifting just enough to catch the smug, predatory satisfaction on the attorney's face before the heavy oak door clicked shut. Kurt let out a slow, deliberate breath through his nose. He is walking right into the center of the trap, he thought, his jaw tightening. At exactly 1:55 p.m., the service elevator doors slid open, and Kate stepped out into the quiet corridor. She was carrying a thin, leather-bound folder against her chest, the symbolic bait that Thorne had demanded. Her navy blue blazer was pristine, her dark hair pinned back into its usual professional chignon, but her face was a mask of rigid, cold determination. The fear that had broken her in the alleyway 10 days ago had been entirely forged into a weapon. As she passed Kurt, she didn't look at his face, but her hand subtly brushed against his white cotton glove in the briefest, most profound translation of solidarity. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the quiet of the hall. "He's alone," Kurt replied, his voice a low, protective growl that carried the absolute weight of his promise to her. "Leave the door unlatched by a fraction of an inch when you enter. I will be right outside the glass pane." Kate took a deep breath, her shoulders rising as she squared them against the mahogany doorframe. She knocked twice, a sharp, definitive sound that seemed to echo through the empty corridor. "Come in," Thorne's smooth, gravelly voice called from within. Kate pushed the door open and stepped into the sprawling, sunlit office. The suite was opulent, lined with leather-bound legal texts, a massive glass desk overlooking the historic square, and a deep, velvet sofa tucked into the far corner near the private washroom. As the door swung shut behind her, Kurt moved instantly. With a silent, predatory grace that defied the heavy weight of his bellman's boots, he crossed the plush carpet and positioned himself flush against the adjacent wall, his ear pressed near the unlatched gap of the door frame, his gray eyes fixed on the reflective brass handle. Inside the office, the sound of paper rustling broke the silence. Kate, you brought the holiday files," Thorne said, his voice carrying an oily, patronizing warmth as he rose from his leather chair. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding the legal department. That wouldn't be a very strategic career move for a rising star in catering." "I was simply ensuring the metrics were flawless, Mr. Thorne," Kate said, her voice steady, though Kurt could detect the faint, underlying vibration of adrenaline beneath her words. "The event budgets require absolute precision before we send them to the corporate board." "The corporate board doesn't look at these files, Kate." Thorne chuckled, the sound of his footsteps moving across the hardwood section of the office floor. "I look at them. I am the filter through which your advancement flows. I thought we established that during our last conversation." "We established many things during our last conversation, Mr. Thorne," Kate said, her tone hardening significantly, "including your complete disregard for the company's code of conduct and standard employee protections." A short, sharp silence followed. Kurt's hand moved to the brass door handle, his fingers tightening until the white fabric of his gloves strained against the seams. "Let's drop the professional theater, shall we?" Thorne's voice dropped into a lower, more menacing register, the smooth arrogance replaced by a sharp, aggressive confidence. "You've been avoiding my calls for 10 days, Kate. You didn't file a complaint with the general manager because you know exactly how that story ends. I own the arbitration framework of this hotel group. If you want that director position, if you want to keep your name on the industry registry in this city, you are going to sit down on that sofa and we are going to reach a mutual understanding regarding your value to my department." "And if I refuse?" Kate challenged, her voice rising slightly, deliberately drawing the attorney deeper into the trap. If I take this digital file with the access logs, the statements from the food and beverage girls, and the medical reports from the clinic, and go straight to the public press, Thorne let out a loud, mocking laugh that made Kurt's blood boil in his veins. The press? Do you think a local newspaper cares about the complaints of a mid-level catering manager against the chief counsel of a multi-billion-dollar empire? Thorne's footsteps stopped right in front of her position. Go ahead. File your lawsuit. I'll countersue you for defamation before the ink is dry on your brief. I'll tie you up in depositions until your savings are entirely depleted, and I will ensure that no hotel from here to London ever lets you past the service gate. I am indispensable to Arthur Lewis, Kate. He built this kingdom on my legal defense. I am completely untouchable. The words hung in the warm, expensive air of the office like a declaration of absolute tyranny. Thorne truly believed his own myth. He believed that the capital at the top of the mountain gave him the right to consume the human beings at the bottom without ever paying the price. Through the gap in the doorframe, Kurt heard the distinct, terrifying sound of fabric shifting, the sudden sharp gasp from Kate as Thorne stepped into her personal space, his hand reaching out to grasp her shoulder. Now, Thorne whispered, his voice laced with venomous confidence. Hand over the files, sit down, and let's fix your career trajectory. Kurt didn't wait for her to scream. He didn't need a signal. With a single violent motion, his broad shoulder slammed into the heavy oak door, throwing it wide open with a thundering crash that shattered the quiet of the executive suite. Thorne spun around with a curse, his fingers releasing Kate's jacket as his eyes locked onto the towering frame of the Bellman, stepping into his pristine office. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. What the hell do you think you're doing? Thorne roared, stepping away from Kate and pointing a shaking finger at Kurt's chest. Vance, I told you to stay by the elevators. You are terminated. Get out of this office before I have security throw you into the street in handcuffs. Kurt didn't back down. He didn't blink. He stepped further into the room, his long strides carrying him until he stood directly between Thorne and Kate, his broad frame acting as an iron wall of protection. He tore off his pillbox cap, tossing it onto the glass desk with a slow, deliberate movement, his gray eyes burning with a cold, lethal intensity that took the attorney completely by surprise. The only person leaving this building in handcuffs, Julian, Kurt said, his voice dropping into a deep, commanding resonance that carried the absolute, unyielding authority of the corporate boardroom, is you. Thorne blinked, a sudden, sharp flicker of confusion crossing his features as he looked at the Bellman's posture, the absolute lack of fear, the precise, elite cadence of his speech. You're a delusional basement boy. I am the head of human resources. I am the chief counsel. You have no authority here. He doesn't. A deep, gravelly voice boomed from the doorway. Thorne's head snapped toward the entrance, his face turning a sudden, ghastly shade of white as the heavy steel fire door swung open fully. Arthur Lewis strode into the room. The billionaire mogul looked massive, his broad shoulders squared beneath a bespoke charcoal suit, his weathered face set into a hard, rigid expression of pure, unbridled fury. Behind him stood two uniformed Metropolitan Police officers, their silver badges catching the bright light of the office, alongside the hotel's general manager, who looked as if he were about to faint onto the plush carpet. Arthur, Thorne stammered, his legal confidence instantly evaporating into a high-pitched, desperate whine as he took a step back toward his desk. Arthur, what is the meaning of this? This Bellman and this catering manager have orchestrated a fraudulent breach of my office. They're attempting to blackmail me with falsified logs. Arthur Lewis didn't look at Thorne. He walked right past him, his massive hand coming down to rest heavily on Kurt's shoulder, squeezing it with a deep, silent pride that sent a jolt of electricity through the room. You did beautifully, son, Arthur said, his deep voice carrying through the quiet office like thunder. He looked over at Kate, his fierce features softening into an expression of profound, loyal respect. And you, Miss Kate, the Lewis Hotel Group owes you a debt that we can never fully repay. Thorne gasped, his eyes darting frantically between the billionaire titan and the maroon uniform of the Bellman standing beside him. The gold fountain pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the glass desk with a hollow, definitive sound. Son, Thorne whispered, the reality of the trap finally snapping shut around his throat. He's your son, Kurt looked at the ruined attorney, his gray eyes reflecting the absolute, unyielding justice of the family name he had spent 4 months concealing. The disguise was over. The bottom of the mountain had spoken, and the alignment of the hotel connections was finally complete. The shattering of the ivory tower, the silence that followed Arthur Lewis's declaration was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of a sudden corporate execution. The sun, streaming through the arched glass windows of the executive suite, caught the dust motes hanging in the warm air, making the room look like a stage setting where the actors had suddenly forgotten their lines. Julian Thorne's face had progressed past a ghastly white. His skin had taken on the gray, waxy hue of a corpse. His hands, usually so steady and expressive when gesturing with his gold pen, were trembling violently against the edge of his mahogany desk. The pristine legal universe he had constructed, a universe built on arbitration clauses, non-disclosure agreements, and the systematic suppression of vulnerable voices, had vanished in the span of a single heartbeat. "Arthur," Thorne stammered, his voice losing its smooth, gravelly confidence, reduced to a desperate, high-pitched plea. He stepped forward, his leather shoes squeaking softly on the hardwood section of the floor. "Arthur, you cannot let this farce dictate your judgment. I have protected this firm for 15 years. I have insulated your properties from catastrophic liabilities. You know my value to the board. This is a coordinated smear campaign by a disgruntled employee and a rogue Bellman who has clearly manipulated the situation." Arthur Lewis did not take his eyes off the attorney. He stood at the center of the plush navy carpet like an ancient oak, his massive shoulders squared, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fierce, unyielding aura that had allowed him to conquer the international hospitality market emanated from him like a physical wave of heat. "A rogue Bellman?" Arthur's voice was dangerously low, a deep rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He slowly turned his head, looking down at Kurt's maroon uniform, then back at Thorne. "That rogue Bellman is the future chairman of the Lewis Hotel Group, Julian, and the fact that you didn't know his face only proves how utterly blind you've become to the reality of my hotels." Arthur took a long, heavy step forward, his shadow completely eclipsing Thorne's desk. "You think you insulated my firm. You think I measure the success of my life by the liability parameters you draw on a piece of parchment. I built the Grand Meridian on the sweat, the dignity, and the trust of the people who enter through the basement gate. When you put your hands on my employees, when you used your corporate title to isolate and terrorize the women who keep these halls clean, you didn't just break the law, Julian. You spit on my name. You tore at the very fabric of the connections that made this company a billionaire empire." Thorne backed away until his spine pressed flush against the glass window pane overlooking the city square. "The data, the files, they have a circumstantial, they are electronic system logs that can be manipulated. In a court of law, Arthur, the burden of proof. This isn't a court of law, Mr. Thorne," Kurt interrupted, stepping up to stand perfectly in line with his father. His gray eyes were lethal, holding the attorney with an elite, commanding intensity that was identical to the titan beside him. Kurt reached into the breast pocket of his uniform, pulling out the small encrypted flash drive containing Kate's compiled archives. He dropped it onto the glass desk with a sharp, definitive click. "The evidence inside that folder is absolute," Kurt said, his voice carrying the precise, unshakable authority of the boardroom. "We have the secondary system, timestamps from the catering servers. We have the forensic DNA results from Kate's blazer, preserved by an independent medical clinic outside the district. And most importantly, we have the signed affidavits of Vance and 2 other former operations employees who were forced to resign under your administration. They aren't anonymous complaints anymore, Julian. They are legal testimonies, and they are all prepared to speak to the Metropolitan Police officers standing right outside your door." Thorne's gaze flicked to the 2 uniformed officers who had stepped into the room, their leather duty belts creaking softly as they positioned themselves on either side of the entrance. The legal counsel's mouth opened, closed, and then opened again, but no sound came out. The absolute finality of the trap had crushed his capacity for litigation. Arthur Lewis turned to the general manager, who was standing near the doorway, sweating profusely through his stiff collar. "Gary," Arthur commanded, his voice sharp and cold. You will immediately revoke Julian Thorne's access permissions to every corporate server, every physical lock, and every financial account associated with the Lewis Group. His employment is terminated, effective this exact second. He is stripped of his title, his bonus allocations, and his severance packages. Furthermore, the Lewis Group will be filing formal corporate charges for fraud, misconduct, and breach of fiduciary duty. Arthur then looked back at Thorne, his eyes hardening into a terrifying display of pure, unbridled fury. You have 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings from that desk under the supervision of these officers. If you are still inside my building at 2:15 p.m., I will have you forcibly removed for criminal trespass. And I promise you, Julian, by the time my personal legal team is finished with you, you will never practice law, handle a corporate brief, or set foot inside a luxury establishment for the rest of your natural life. Thorne looked at Arthur, then at Kurt, and finally at Kate, who stood beside the bell stand, her posture straight, her hazel eyes bright with a profound, victorious justice. Realizing that the empire he had tried to weaponize had turned completely against him, Thorne slumped his shoulders, his arrogant posture collapsing into the broken form of a defeated predator. Without a single word, he reached down, snatched his briefcase from the floor, and allowed the two officers to escort him out of the room, the double oak doors clicking shut behind them. The heavy silence returned to the office, but the oppressive weight had lifted completely, replaced by a clean, light air that felt like the first day of spring after a brutal winter. Arthur Lewis let out a long, shuddering breath, his massive shoulders dropping slightly as the rage left his frame. He turned toward Kate, his fierce features softening entirely into an expression of deep, humble respect. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away, and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound deference from a billionaire mogul to a mid-level manager. "Miss Kate," Arthur said, his gravelly voice carrying a warm, emotional resonance. "I want to offer you my most sincere, personal apology for the cruelty you suffered under this roof. You trusted my name when you took this job, and the corporate structure failed to protect you. That is a failure that sits directly on my desk." Kate looked at the legendary titan, her chest heaving as she swallowed the residual emotion of the past 10 days. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis, but I didn't do this alone. If it wasn't for Kurt, if it wasn't for the guard at the basement desk who caught me when I broke down, I would have cleared out my locker and vanished like all the other girls." Arthur looked over at his son, a brilliant, proud smile breaking across his weathered face. He reached out, his massive hand coming down on Kurt's shoulder once more, squeezing it with an intensity that spoke volumes. "He did his job, Kate," Arthur said softly. "He did exactly what I sent him down there to do. He learned the character of the people who represent our name, and he found the most important connection this hotel has ever produced." Arthur turned back to Kurt, his eyes carrying a deep, unspoken passing of the torch. "I'll leave you to handle the cleanup, son. The general manager's office is waiting for your transition schedule. The basement rotation is officially over." With a final, encouraging nod, Arthur Lewis strode out of the suite, leaving Kurt and Kate alone in the massive, sunlit office. Kurt stood in the center of the room, suddenly hyper-aware of the stiff, maroon wool of his uniform and the false name on his brass badge. He turned toward Kate, his gray eyes wide with a deep, silent vulnerability that had nothing to do with corporate authority. "Kate," he said softly, his voice dropping into that warm, intimate register she had grown to trust in the concrete corridors of the sublevel. "I am so incredibly sorry for concealing my identity from you." Kate looked at him, her hazel eyes studying the contours of his face, the sharp jawline, the piercing gray eyes that she now recognized as the true lineage of the Lewis Empire. A small, complex smile touched her lips as she walked toward him, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor until she stood just inches away from his maroon coat. "Kurt Vance, or should I say Kurt Lewis?" she asked gently, her voice carrying a light, teasing edge that cut through the last remnants of his anxiety. "The Bellman who knows kitchen logistics and corporate law. I suppose the story about your father telling you about the ownership structure wasn't entirely a lie." "It wasn't," Kurt said earnestly, his long fingers reaching out, wanting to touch her hand, but hesitating at the boundary of his new reality. "My father built everything from nothing, Kate. He wanted to make sure that before I ever sat in an executive chair, I understood the weight of the people who hold the mountain up. He sent me to the bottom, so I could see the truth of this hotel when no one was looking. He wanted me to know who was loyal, who was kind, and who possessed the true character of a hotelier. He looked into her hazel eyes, his heart doing that familiar, high-velocity flip against his ribs. And during those cold mornings at the security gate, watching you greet the kitchen maids and the laundry crew with the same profound respect you offered to the directors, I found the exact definition of what a leader should be. I fell in love with your character, Kate, long before I ever knew how to tell you who I really was. Kate looked up at him, her eyes shining with a brilliance that outshone the crystal chandeliers of the lobby. She didn't look at the luxury office. She didn't look at the legacy of the Lewis name. She looked directly into the gray eyes of the young man who had sat with her on a concrete floor in a freezing alleyway and promised to fight for her safety. She reached out, her fingers closing around his hand, her warmth instantly sealing the connection they had built in the shadows. "The uniform doesn't matter, Kurt," she whispered, her smile breaking through with an absolute, unyielding beauty. "The name on the badge doesn't change the man who kept the watch at the gate. You were a good hotelier when you carried the bags, and you'll be a great one when you run the board. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," he said instantly. "Don't ever get rid of that maroon coat," she teased softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It reminds me of the best security guard I ever met." Kurt laughed, a rich, genuine sound that filled the empty executive office, signaling the end of the old order and the beginning of a transformation that would change the Grand Meridian forever. The alchemy of care, the transition from the brass-buttoned uniform of Kurt Vance to the tailored charcoal three-piece suits of Kurt Lewis, Executive Vice President of Operations, was not a quiet affair, but it was executed with a surgical, quiet intensity. The Grand Meridian did not stop running. A luxury hotel cannot afford to close its doors for a structural reorganization. Instead, the transformation occurred from the inside out, like an engine being rebuilt while the vehicle was still navigating the highway. On his first official day in the executive suite, Kurt did not sit behind the massive glass desk that had once belonged to Julian Thorne. He had the desk removed entirely, replacing it with a round, solid oak table that sat in the center of the office, surrounded by comfortable leather chairs. An executive desk is a barrier to communication, Kurt had told the general manager, Gary, who was still looking remarkably pale weeks after the execution on the third floor. "We are here to facilitate connections, Gary. We aren't here to build fortresses." Kurt's primary objective during his first month was a comprehensive cultural audit of the hotel's entire roster. He did not look at the employee file metrics from his leather-bound chair. He walked the building. He spent his mornings in the subterranean laundry quarters, watching the massive steam presses operate. He spent his afternoons in the high-volume banquet kitchens, observing how the line captains handled the pressure of a 500-person plating sequence. And he spent his evenings standing near the security checkpoint at the employee entrance, watching how the middle management directors greeted the night shift workers as they punched their time cards. He was looking for character. He was looking for the invisible, sacred hoteliers who understood that the true foundation of a five-star luxury brand was not built on marble and crystal, but on the dignity of the human beings who kept those assets clean. The clearing of the old regime was swift and uncompromising. Sterling, the fastidious director of rooms who had once referred to the housekeeping staff as the labor, was the first to be called to the round oak table on the third floor. "I've reviewed the departmental turnover rates for the rooms division over the last 3 quarters, Sterling," Kurt said, his gray eyes holding the director's manicured gaze with a cold, unyielding precision that was identical to his father's. "You have a 42% attrition rate among your room attendants. The industry average is 20. When I looked into the exit interviews, the primary complaint was a hostile, dismissive management style that prioritized occupancy speed over physical safety." Sterling had adjusted his gold cufflinks, a nervous, patronizing smile twitching on his lips. "Mr. Lewis, with all due respect, those maids are easily replaced. The market is saturated with unskilled labor. We must maintain our room prep metrics to satisfy our high-end clientele." "Unskilled labor?" Kurt's voice dropped into a low, quiet baritone that made the air in the room turn instantly cold. The women who prep those suites can spot a microscopic stain on a linen sheet from 10 feet away. They manage a complex, physical logistical cycle in 30-minute blocks while carrying 70-pound utility carts. That is not unskilled sterling. That is professional precision. And the client does not stay at the Meridian because of your metrics. They stay because the room is pristine. You have failing marks in leadership, empathy, and respect. Your contract with the Lewis Hotel Group is terminated, effective at the end of the shift today. Sterling's jaw dropped, his manicured hands freezing against his lapels. You're letting me go? Over the complaints of the cleaning crew. I've been with this property. The cleaning crew represents the name on my father's building, Kurt said, rising from his chair to stand at his full height, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the oak table. You do not. Have a wonderful afternoon, Sterling. The dismissal sent a shockwave of absolute clarity through every department head in the hotel. The message was clear. The era of untouchable executive privilege was over. The priority was no longer the metric, but the connection. But Kurt's strategy was not merely one of purging, it was one of elevation. For those who demonstrated the true spirit of hospitality, he opened the floodgates of opportunity. He established the Lewis Academy of Hospitality Management, a fully funded internal training program that allowed entry-level employees from the housekeeping, laundry, and kitchen divisions to pursue corporate management certifications during paid working hours. He restructured the compensation brackets, utilizing the savings from the terminated executive bonuses to increase the hourly wages of the frontline staff by 25%, making the Grand Meridian the highest-paying employer in the regional hospitality market. And at the center of this cultural renaissance stood Kate. She had been formally promoted to Director of Events and Catering Operations. Her promotion file signed not with the transactional grease of Julian Thorne's pen, but with the proud, bold signature of Arthur Lewis. She now managed a team of 15 event coordinators, her warm, inclusive leadership style transforming the catering division into the most efficient, creative, and loyal department in the entire property. She and Kurt maintained a strict, professional decorum during working hours. They met in the high-stakes banquet consultations or the executive boardrooms, their interactions defined by a sharp, mutual respect that inspired the rest of the management staff. But in the quiet hours of the evening, after the last convention guests had retired to their suites and the great chandeliers of the lobby were dimmed to their warm, holiday glow, they would meet in the sub-level archives. The banquet revenue reports for the first quarter are up 18%. Kate said on a Tuesday evening in early spring, sliding a leather folder onto the vintage oak table in their storage sanctuary. She had a streak of blue dry erase marker on her temple, and her navy blazer was slightly rumpled, but her hazel eyes were bright with a triumphant, unburdened brilliance. And the culinary staff hasn't logged a single hour of unplanned overtime. The patisserie outsourcing strategy you suggested back when you were Vance saved us over $40,000 in operational friction. Kurt smiled, stepping close to her, his hands gently reaching out to wrap around her waist. He pulled her against his chest, the scent of his pine cologne mixing with the familiar, clean scent of her apple blossom shampoo. I told you the acquisitions department had an eye for kitchen logistics, he murmured, his gray eyes looking down into hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. You're a very arrogant vice president, Kurt Lewis, she teased, her fingers lightly tracing the lapels of his tailored suit jacket before she reached up to gently touch the small space behind his silver lapel pin. But I suppose the data supports your claims. The staff is happy. The laundry maids are sending their children to college with the new educational stipends. You've turned this fortress into a real home. We did it, Kate, Kurt said softly, his forehead resting gently against hers in the quiet, dusty room. We showed them that the connection at the bottom is the only thing that actually keeps the mountain standing. He held her tightly against the draft of the sub-level, his heart beating with a deep, unshakable certainty. The 6-month experiment his father had devised had not just humbled him, it had saved him. It had stripped away the academic theories of Lausanne and the elite arrogance of his pedigree, leaving him with the pure, unadulterated truth of his human responsibility. He was a hotelier, not because he owned the deed to the limestone walls, but because he was willing to stand at the gate and keep the watch over the people who made the Grand Machine breathe. He knew that the transformation of the Grand Meridian was only the first step in a much larger journey. He had an empire to inherit, a global portfolio of properties that required the same radical alignment of care. But as he looked at Kate's beautiful, smiling face under the single hanging bulb of the storage room, he knew that no matter how high his climb took him, his anchor would always remain right here, at the concrete gate where the connections were real and where his heart had first found its home. The architecture of the awake 2 years is a lifetime in the hospitality industry, yet it can pass with the quiet, seamless velocity of a revolving door. Under Kurt's leadership, the Grand Meridian had transitioned from a gilded fortress of cold, corporate prestige into a legendary case study of human-centric capitalism. The industry journals, which had once praised the property solely for its high room rates, now ran front-page profiles on the Lewis paradigm. Kurt had proved, with cold and undeniable metrics, what his father had always suspected, that a hotel's revenue is directly tied to the dignity of its lowest-paid employee. By the spring of his second year as executive vice president, the hotel's gross revenue had doubled. It was an achievement that defied the cynical projections of the regional hospitality board. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. By stripping away the bloated, defensive legal structures of the old regime, eliminating the high-turnover recruitment costs, and investing those savings directly into the staff's wages, Kurt had built a fortress of operational loyalty. The room attendants were no longer rushing through 30-minute blocks. They were pristine artisans who took ownership of their floors. The culinary teams were no longer working through exhaustion. They were creating award-winning culinary programs that drew high-paying local clientele to the hotel's dining rooms. But the most significant transformation was found in the daily rhythm of the building. The subterranean concrete corridors of the basement were no longer silent, drafty places of survival. They were clean, bright, and vibrant, filled with the warmth of employees who felt valued, respected, and heard. At exactly 5:00 p.m. on a crisp, golden April evening, Kurt stood in the executive suite on the 3rd floor. He was wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal suit, his silver lapel pin catching the late afternoon sun, but he wasn't looking at the financial spreadsheets on his round oak table. His hand was slipped deep into his trouser pocket, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool velvet of a small square box. Inside the box sat a platinum band, holding a flawless, brilliant-cut diamond. It was a ring he had selected himself, not from a luxury catalogue, but from a master jeweler whose studio sat in the heart of the arts district, just a few blocks from the loft he and Kate had shared for the last 18 months. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Arthur Lewis walked into the room. The billionaire titan looked older, the silver in his hair now a striking, permanent crown, but his grey eyes were bright with a deep, unshakable contentment. He walked over to his son, his eyes falling on the nervous, rhythmic movement of Kurt's hand in his pocket. "You're pacing, Kurt," Arthur said, his gravelly voice carrying a warm, teasing chuckle, "just like your mother did before she agreed to marry a grease-stained boiler room assistant 50 years ago." Kurt stopped his movement, a soft smile breaking across his face. "I am not pacing, Dad. I am merely calibrating my internal equilibrium to a horizontal surface." Arthur let out a rich, booming laugh, his massive hand coming down on his son's shoulder, squeezing it with an intensity that spoke of half a century of pride, struggle, and shared victory. "You've done a magnificent job here, son. Your mother would have been so proud of the man you've become. You didn't just run my hotel, you saved its soul. The board approved the transition of the European properties to your management style this morning. You're ready to take the chair." "Thank you, Dad," Kurt said softly, looking out the window at the bustling city square. "But I didn't do it alone. I had the best connection in the hotel guiding me." "Then don't keep her waiting," Arthur smiled, his eyes warm with a quiet, paternal blessing. "The evening shift is about to change, and the gate is waiting." The gate of beginnings, the air at the employee entrance was cool, carrying the sweet, clean scent of blooming cherry blossoms from the nearby park and the fresh, electric promise of spring. The shifting twilight had turned the concrete alleyway into a quiet corridor of violet and gold shadows, far away from the blinding neon glare of the main lobby. At exactly 5:45 p.m., The heavy steel fire door at the end of the concrete ramp clicked open. Kate walked out into the cool evening air. She was wearing her favorite navy blue blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a neat, professional chignon, her silver name tag polished to a brilliant shine. She was carrying her leather portfolio under her arm, her shoulders slightly relaxed after a grueling but victorious weekend convention wrap-up. She took a deep breath of the fresh spring air, her eyes scanning the quiet alleyway. She froze, standing near the concrete security gate, the very spot where they had logged early morning timesheets, exchanged quiet, tired complaints, and shared foil-wrapped chocolates, was Kurt. He wasn't wearing his executive suit jacket. He stood in his crisp white shirt, his charcoal trousers pressed to a perfect edge, his tie loosened slightly in the cool breeze. But it was his posture that made her breath catch in her throat. He was leaning against the cold iron railing of the security desk, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the entire world outside the alleyway cease to exist. "Kurt," she whispered, her voice carrying a soft, trembling wonder as she walked down the concrete ramp. "What are you doing down here? The board of directors is waiting for you in the main dining room." "Let them wait," Kurt said, his voice dropping into that deep, low baritone that had been her sanctuary through every storm. He stepped away from the railing, his long strides closing the distance between them until he stood just inches away from her. He reached out, his fingers gently taking the leather portfolio from her hands and placing it on the grey security desk behind him. He took her hands in his warm fingers finding their familiar, comfortable home within her grip. "2 years ago, Kate, my father sent me down to this gate with a brass badge and a false name," Kurt said softly, his eyes reflecting the soft, golden light of the twilight. "He wanted me to learn the character of the people who held this hotel up. He wanted me to see who they were when the world wasn't looking." He took a slow, deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he looked down at her beautiful, radiant face. "And right here, at this concrete gate, I met a woman who didn't care about my pedigree, my wealth, or my future. She looked at a frozen, exhausted Bellman and saw a human being. She offered me respect, she offered me her trust, and she showed me what it truly means to care for another person under this roof." Kurt slowly dropped to one knee on the concrete pavement of the alleyway, the very pavement where she had once wept in his arms, and where they had forged the connection that had saved the Grand Meridian. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small velvet box and opening it to reveal the brilliant, sparkling platinum ring. "Kate," Kurt whispered, his voice thick with a profound, emotional sincerity that echoed beautifully against the brick walls of the corridor. "You are the heart of this hotel, and you are the anchor of my life. I don't want to run this mountain without you beside me. Will you marry me, and let us build the rest of our connections together?" Kate looked down at him, her hazel eyes filling with a sudden, joyful rush of tears that glittered like diamonds in the twilight. She looked at the ring, then back at his face, at the quiet, unyielding young man who had kept the watch over her safety and who had rewritten the destiny of an empire just to keep her safe. A brilliant, breathtaking smile broke across her face, her chest heaving as she let out a soft, happy laugh. "Yes, Kurt," she whispered, her voice carrying a deep, unshakable certainty as she knelt down on the concrete beside him, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. "1,000 times yes." Kurt let out a long, shuddering breath of pure relief, his arms wrapping securely around her waist as he pulled her into his chest, lifting her slightly off the ground. The cold concrete of the alleyway, the iron rails of the security gate, and the heavy limestone walls of the Grand Hotel faded into absolute insignificance against the warmth of their embrace. They had started at the bottom, in the dark corners of the basement where the invisible work was done. And there, amid the heavy bags and the silent struggles, they had built the most valuable connection of all, a love that would stand as the true, eternal foundation of the Grand Meridian, one beautiful connection at a time. The end.